The pattern break. There was a man who worked for 27 years at the same company. He earned a solid salary. He bought a house in a good neighborhood. He drove a reliable car. He sent his kids to decent schools. Every few years, he got a raise. Every few years, he upgraded something: the car, the kitchen, the vacation destination. From the outside, it looked like a life well built. But when he sat down at 54 years old to calculate his actual net worth, the real number, not the image, he discovered something quietly devastating. After 27 years of working, after decades of raises and upgrades and keeping up appearances, he had less than $40,000 saved. His house had a mortgage. His car had payments. His credit card carried a balance. His lifestyle had expanded with every raise. And the money, the real, free, working for him money, had barely grown at all. He wasn't poor. Nobody would have called him poor. But he wasn't wealthy either. He was something far more common and far more invisible. He was rich in appearance and broke in reality. And the strangest part? He had done everything the world told him to do. Act 1. The Hidden System. For most of modern history, there existed a version of success that most people inherited without ever choosing it. It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't explained by parents because parents had inherited it too, from their parents who had inherited it from theirs. It was a feeling, a picture, a set of symbols. A car meant you had made it. A house meant you were stable. A credit card meant you were trusted. A salary meant you were secure. A lifestyle meant you were winning. Nobody designed these beliefs in a dark room somewhere. They evolved slowly through advertising, through culture, through comparison, through the deeply human need to feel like things were going well. But somewhere inside this invisible belief system, a very quiet, very dangerous confusion had taken root. People confuse the symbols of wealth with wealth itself. They confuse looking wealthy with being wealthy. And because everyone around them was playing the same game, buying the same things, taking on the same debts, chasing the same appearances, nobody stopped to question the rules. It felt normal because it was normal. And that was the trap. Act 2. Where it came from. To understand how this confusion became so widespread, it helped to look back at where it began. After World War II, something extraordinary happened in Western economies. Factories that had been built for war were now producing goods for peace. Companies had manufacturing capacity, banks had capital, and governments needed citizens to spend. Consumption became patriotic. Buying things became the engine of the economy. And slowly, carefully, the culture around spending was rebuilt from the ground up. Advertising agencies hired psychologists. They studied what made people feel good, feel successful, feel accepted. They discovered that people didn't just buy things for function, they bought things for identity. A car wasn't just transportation, it was status. A house wasn't just shelter, it was achievement. Clothes weren't just fabric, they were belonging. And so the great packaging of wealth began. The image of wealth was made cheap enough to access. Credit made it possible, monthly payments made it invisible, and the feeling, the glorious addictive feeling of looking like you had arrived, was made available to almost everyone. The only cost was the actual money people would never build. Slowly, across generations, the performance of wealth replaced the pursuit of it. People stopped asking, how much do I own, and started asking, how much can I afford per month? And that shift, subtle, gradual, almost invisible, changed everything. Act 3. The 6 Things. There were 6 specific things that carried this illusion most powerfully. 6 things that generation after generation believed were signs of financial success, but were in reality something else entirely. Thing 1. A high salary. The first thing was the paycheck. For most people, a high salary felt like the answer to everything. Earn more, have more. It seemed like the simplest logic in the world. And it was the first place the illusion began. What research on earning and spending had consistently shown was something called a lifestyle inflation, the quiet, almost automatic process by which spending expanded to match income. Every raise was absorbed. Every promotion came with a new expense. A better apartment, a newer car, nicer restaurants, better clothes. Studies on lottery winners, sudden income earners, and high-salaried professionals repeatedly revealed the same uncomfortable truth. Income alone did not build wealth. What was kept, not what was earned, determined financial position over time. A person earning $150,000 a year and spending $148,000 was financially closer to a person earning $40,000 than anyone wanted to admit. The salary felt like security, but without the discipline to convert income into assets, it was just a faster running treadmill. The amount on the paycheck grew, the actual freedom didn't move. Thing 2. Owning a home. The second thing was the house. Home ownership had been sold for decades as the cornerstone of wealth building. It was so deeply embedded in cultural identity that questioning it felt almost irresponsible. But the math told a more complicated story. Economist Robert Shiller, who spent decades studying housing prices, found that after accounting for inflation, the actual long-term return on residential real estate was relatively modest. It was far below what most people imagined when they called their home an investment. And that was before the costs were added in. Mortgage interest, property taxes, maintenance and repairs, historically estimated at 1 to 2% of home value annually, insurance, HOA fees, transaction costs when buying and selling, renovations that almost never returned their full value. A house consumed money constantly. It required attention, upkeep, and continued spending. And for most middle-class families, it was the single largest financial obligation of their lives. For those who bought in the right place at the right time and sold well, it built equity. For many others, it locked up capital in an illiquid asset while delivering a sense of wealth that didn't translate to actual financial freedom. The house felt like building something, but for millions, it was the thing that made saving everything else nearly impossible. Thing 3. Credit cards and credit scores. The third thing was the credit score. At some point in the financial culture, having a good credit score began to feel like proof of financial health. People tracked it anxiously, celebrated when it rose, felt pride when it crossed certain thresholds. But a credit score, at its core, measured only one thing: how reliably a person paid back borrowed money. It had nothing to do with how much was saved, nothing to do with net worth, nothing to do with financial independence. In fact, the behaviors that built a high credit score were the exact behaviors that kept people engaged in a cycle of borrowing, regularly using credit, carrying manageable balances, maintaining long histories of debt. A person could have a credit score of 780 and own almost nothing. A person could have a modest score and be sitting on a paid-off property and a growing investment account. The credit score was a grade given by lenders. It measured how useful someone was to the lending industry, not how wealthy they actually were. But the culture had dressed it up as a badge of financial achievement, and millions carried that badge with pride, even as a system it represented quietly extracted money from their lives through interest, fees, and the slow, comfortable normalization of living on borrowed funds. Thing 4. Expensive possessions. The fourth thing was the stuff. The car, the watch, the designer bag, the renovated kitchen, the backyard nobody used but everyone could see. These things had become a language, a visual vocabulary of success that people read instantly and mostly unconsciously. Research in consumer psychology had long documented the power of these signals. Thorsten Veblen had written about conspicuous consumption as far back as 1899. The ideal that certain purchases existed not for function but for display, to signal rank, to communicate arrival. What had changed in the modern era was accessibility. Credit and financing made it possible for almost anyone to carry the symbols of the wealthy, even while holding none of the actual wealth. And here was the cruelest part of this particular trap. Truly wealthy individuals often spent less on visible luxury than people assumed. Many drove modest cars, lived in average neighborhoods, avoided flashy clothing. Their wealth was invisible precisely because it was not being spent on appearances. The people spending most aggressively on visible symbols were often those least able to afford them, buying the appearance of arrival with money that could have funded the actual journey. The expensive possession felt like success had been achieved. Most of the time, it was proof that the trap had closed. Thing 5. A stable job for decades. The fifth thing was the long career. For generations, staying in one company for 20 or 30 years was understood to be a sign of reliability, security, and eventual reward. The pension, the gold watch, the retirement with dignity. It was a deal that existed, and for the generation that benefited from it, it worked. But that deal had quietly changed. Over the latter decades of the 20th century, defined benefit pensions were steadily replaced by defined contribution plans, shifting the risk of retirement savings from employers to employees. Job tenure declined. Layoffs became normalized. The idea of a company that would take care of a loyal worker for life faded, but the cultural belief in job security as a form of wealth did not fade with it. What many people didn't see was that decades spent in a single salary-earning role left them with one fragile thread of financial security: the paycheck. And the paycheck, as established earlier, was only as good as the discipline applied to what was done with it. A long, stable career felt like wealth being built, but unless that career was financing the actual accumulation of assets, it was just a long delay of the same problem. The job felt like security, but it was security on borrowed time. Thing 6. Appearing financially comfortable. The sixth thing was perhaps the most dangerous of all. It was the feeling itself. The feeling of being okay. Of looking like things were fine. Of projecting an image that said, we have what we need. The avoidance of the awkward conversation. The unwillingness to say openly that the numbers didn't work. This was the quietest trap because it required no spending. It required only silence. Financial anxiety research had consistently shown that large portions of households reporting financial stress still describe themselves publicly as comfortable. The gap between financial reality and financial image was wide and actively maintained, because admitting a problem required confronting a problem, and confronting a problem meant accepting that the path chosen had not been working. So the image was kept up. The conversations were avoided. The statements weren't opened. The budget wasn't made. And years passed inside a feeling of okayness that was slowly, quietly proven false. The appearance of financial comfort was perhaps the most elegant trap in the entire system, because it didn't cost anything to maintain. It just cost everything that could have been built. Act 4. The psychology behind the trap. What made these 6 illusions so persistent wasn't stupidity, it wasn't laziness, it wasn't even ignorance in the traditional sense. It was psychology. The human brain was wired for comparison. Status hierarchies were ancient, deeply embedded in social behavior long before money existed. Belonging to the group, signaling competence, avoiding shame, these drives were not weaknesses. They were survival instincts adapted to a world that no longer worked the way those instincts assumed. And the modern economy had learned to speak directly to those instincts. The car commercial didn't show a financing agreement, it showed a road and a feeling of freedom. The real estate advertisement didn't show a mortgage amortization table, it showed a family happy in a warm kitchen. The credit card didn't market itself as a debt instrument. It marketed rewards, travel, and the feeling of being someone who deserved the nice things. Every message was crafted to bypass the calculating part of the brain and land instead in the emotional center, the part that wanted to feel successful, safe, respected. And once the decision was made emotionally, the rational mind did something fascinating. It justified. It found reasons why this particular car was a practical necessity, why this particular house was actually a smart investment, why this particular credit card's rewards made the interest almost irrelevant. Psychologists call this post-purchase rationalization. The decision had already been made. The logic was assembled afterward to make peace with it. And then, over time, the behavior became identity. People stopped seeing themselves as people who had made a financial choice. They saw themselves as people who were a certain kind of person. The kind who owned a home, drove a good car, kept up appearances, had a stable job, maintained a good credit score. To challenge the choice was to challenge the identity. And that was where the trap completed itself. Because now people weren't just defending a financial decision, they were defending who they were. Friends who questioned the system were called negative. Minimalists were called cheap. People who drove old cars were pitied. People who rented were told they were throwing money away. The system had been internalized so completely that its defenders didn't even know they were defending it. Dark Act 5. What actual wealth turned out to be. When researchers, biographers, and financial historians looked at people who had quietly built real wealth, certain patterns kept appearing. It wasn't about the salary. Warren Buffett had said that building wealth was about not spending what was earned. Not because spending was immoral, but because every dollar spent was a dollar that could not be put to work generating more dollars. The math of compounding was slow at first, and then, eventually, it wasn't. But patience was required in an economy that sold impatience. It wasn't about the house. Many of the wealthy held real estate, but they understood the difference between a home and income-generating property. The house they lived in was a cost. The properties that paid them rent were assets. It wasn't about the job. Income from work was called active income. It stopped the moment the work stopped. What built lasting financial security was passive income. Money that continued arriving whether or not the work was being done. Dividends, rent, royalties, business income. These were the things that actually freed people. It wasn't about looking a certain way. The research on actual millionaires showed again and again that many of them looked ordinary. They lived below their means. They drove normal cars. They wore unremarkable clothes. Their wealth was invisible precisely because it was not being displayed. It was being grown. Real wealth, it turned out, was not a feeling or an image. It was options. The option to stop working without losing everything. The option to say no to a bad situation. The option to take time, change direction, make choices from a position of security rather than desperation. A person with $10,000 in genuine savings had more real wealth than a person with a $90,000 salary and $95,000 in annual expenses. Not because of the number, but because of the freedom the number represented. Freedom was the actual currency, and it was the one thing the system had never marketed. Philosophical close. The realization that changed everything. The man who had worked for 27 years and found himself at 54 with less than $40,000 saved didn't come to his realization in a dramatic moment. It came quietly, on a Tuesday evening, at a kitchen table with a spreadsheet and a cup of coffee. He added up the numbers. He looked at what was owned outright and what was still owed. He looked at what was earning money on its own and what was costing money every month. He looked at the gap between the image of the life he had built and the financial reality underneath it, and he understood, slowly, that he had been playing a game he had never agreed to play. He had followed the rules of a system he had never examined. He had measured his success by symbols he had never chosen. He had spent his most productive decades building a picture of wealth rather than wealth itself. He wasn't angry. He was something quieter than that. He was awake. Because the most important thing that happened in that kitchen that evening wasn't the discovery that he had made mistakes. The most important thing was the discovery that the mistakes had a pattern, that the pattern had a design, that the design was older than he was and larger than he was and would continue long after he sat down at his own table. Millions of people were living inside that same picture, working hard, keeping up, looking fine, feeling like the wealth was coming. Just a little further down the road, after the next raise, after the house appreciated, after the kids were through school, and the system would keep offering the same symbols, the same signals, the same seductive feeling of having arrived, because the system was not designed to make people wealthy. It was designed to make people spend. And as long as the two things were confused, spending and building, appearing wealthy and being wealthy, the system would continue functioning exactly as intended. Most people would never see it, not because they weren't intelligent, not because they weren't working hard, but because the system had learned to look like the only reasonable way to live. That was the realization that the man carried with him from that kitchen table forward. Not despair, not bitterness, just clarity. And with clarity, finally, came the first real chance to build something that didn't need to be explained at a dinner party or displayed in a driveway. Something quiet, something permanent, something real. The system was always there. Most people simply never had a reason to look at it directly. And that realization, that simple, uncomfortable, liberating realization, changed everything. Thank you for watching. If this felt like something worth keeping, it probably was.